Hello, my dystopian friends, and welcome back to our cybernetic neoliberal dystopia, where we will be talking about Carl Ratner's Neoliberal Psychology, yet another work that tried to warn us about our post apocalyptic present. So, we are not going to go through his neoliberal snapshots of neoliberalism. I hope that we are doing a good job on my channel with regards to various snapshots of neoliberalism, trying to understand what neoliberalism is. But we are going to go into macro cultural psychology. Macro cultural psychology here is seen where we have all of these different factors that come into creating this neoliberal self. Now, the only thing I disagree with, or my basic epistemological difference from this cultural psychology, is that I believe that this neoliberal self, this neoliberal subjectivity, is a form of ontotheology. So I think that it is, in a way, a religion unto itself. Now, I am not against religion. I don't think that there is a red pill and a blue pill. I think that you look at reality through the dream, and that's the best way of analyzing reality. But this is, I guess, Carl Ratner's way of trying to understand what neoliberal psychology is. He sees a political economy and the classes and the state as enforcing through all these different media news. When I say media, I'm referring to like a Marshall McLuhan-esque media, through the faculties of psychology and our ideologies, through our religions, through the media, through beauty ideals, through healthcare and family and the arts and language. All these different snapshots, which he went through, some of them earlier part of his work, and even education itself as all contributing to this neoliberal subjectivity, which I think is a fine understanding of what's going on. And this is kind of the macro cultural psychological perspective. So I'm not going to get too much into the basic methodological work. There are differences in various approaches to understanding what neoliberal subjectivity are. I came to this idea through my own understanding of philosophy, through a philosophical understanding. This person, Carl Ratner, he comes at it through a psychological understanding. The neoliberal education, enforcer of the neoliberal class structure, and that includes all of what is included, what is acceptable to say within the modern university structure. So the university has very rarely ever been a site of true dissent. Maybe in the May 68 era, or maybe through the establishments of student unions in the past. But today, all aspects of neoliberal education really conform to this kind of academic neoliberalism, even especially the kinds of academia that sees itself as being transgressive in most respects. Culture obscuring itself to its people. Just as how the ideology of neoliberalism becomes so ubiquitous that it becomes so difficult to see, same with academia. Academia is so entrenched within the ideology of neoliberalism that it almost fails to notice its own complicity in most cases. The wealth of evidence about neoliberal society documents that neoliberal capitalism is oppressive at its core. And why is that? Is because capitalism requires on surplus labor. What is surplus labor? Surplus labor, let's say, for example, you're renting a home. Okay, there's two different ways of renting a home. Let's say that the owner of this home is some foreigner, and the person who gets a contract of this home, let's say it's a 5-bedroom apartment, and the person who gets the contract for this, let's say, $2,000 apartment, you can get that contract as the contract signer and basically find people to, let's say you're a student and you need to find people to live with. You can find your own friends. You can split that $2,000 price into 5 ways, or you can find people who are basically, you can feign friends or pretend to be friends or roommates with people and basically charge them a little bit more than you would, because you are the risk taker, because you are the contract holder. You can charge them a little bit more, and you can charge them, let's say if there's 5 people, you can charge them, and let's say it's a 6-person apartment and you're the 6th person, you can charge them enough so that you can pay off your own rent. Why? Because you have taken on the obligation of risk in this situation. Now, I'm telling you from my own example of living in Montreal, where most people would just share or split the rent as it should be, and my experience living in Vancouver, where people would basically charge higher rents even if they are not the owner. They become a middleman. So the whole capitalist system is basically based or premised off of many layers of these middlemen basically skimming from the top. Whether you're a franchise owner or whatever you're doing, whether you are participating in the logistics of shipping goods from China, you are always being a middleman. And that's what patents do, really. Patents, a lot of the times, the public sphere, the government money goes to making these products, and private corporations patent these medical goods, and they are able to basically become a form of middleman in this structure as well. They all skim from the top. That is why emotions cannot be participating in that skimming from the top system. Today, what I find incredibly evil is trying to basically rainbow wash within our corporations. Oh, we need to care about people's feelings. Oh, we need to do this, we need to do that, when the whole capitalist system is based off of basically exploitation of surplus labor. So every time you hear all this stuff about caring about workers and all that stuff, a corporation, for example, pretends to care about workers, that corporation is basically marketing itself and is participating in a neoliberal form of entrepreneurial social capitalism, where every aspect of our lives becomes a matter of cost-benefit analysis, and as a result, every aspect of our lives becomes a matter of exploitation of surplus labor as well, with a smile on your face. And that's what the whole Starbucks corporation is based off of, when you are destroying the rainforest, but with every cup of coffee that you buy, the externality of the destruction of the rainforest is put back into the cost of the coffee, and you are able to basically rebuild the rainforest that you destroyed through other means. It's really quite insidious, and that's why I think it's incredibly evil. And it's much more sophisticated than the types of totalitarianism that we see in, for example, Russia. So this kind of social capitalism obscures itself to its own people. We have all of this moralistic and economic language that comes in our psychological thinking and basically destroys the relationships that we can have with one another. And a lot of what I'm saying is within Bourdieu's idea of habitus. What Bourdieu calls habitus, I call collective ritual or ritual ideology, where our actions, our daily actions, have an imposition upon us, where even though we might want to change the system, and the epitome of this is with Roxane Gay feminism, where Roxane Gay says it's, you have all these ideals about anti-capitalism and feminism, but in your everyday life, it's totally okay to do the opposite of what you preach. Habitus is that system of subjective dispositions which act as a mediation between structures and practices. Structures reproduce themselves by producing agents endowed with the system of predispositions which is capable of engendering practices adapted to the structures and thereby contributing to the reproduction of these structures. Inevitably, inscribed within the dispositions of the habitus is the whole structure of the system of conditions as it presents itself in the experience of a life condition, occupying a particular position within that structure. So in a way, this structure it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy within our actions and socially reproduces itself. In the book, Ratner identifies three forms of neoliberal psychology. The capitalist form of psychology will be exemplified in developmental psychology and also in sexuality that is practiced in hookup interpersonal interactions. And that is basically, I think, the start of what I call the cyberpunk dystopia that we live in, which is the masturbatory kind of love, the kind of love as being entrenched within capitalism, the kind of love that upholds this privileged thinking. And this is done by the Pandora's box that was opened by, for example, Bell Hooks and her All About Love, that is preached and seen all over Instagram today, as Bell Hooks has become, unfortunately, a martyr for neoliberalism, and her best friend is Gloria Steinem, for good reason, or good friend of hers. Second, the class structure that prepares, administers, and distributes psychology will be exemplified in several psychological phenomena such as linguistic codes. And for me, I would say, again, this is these idioms, these psychological idioms, these pop psychology idioms that we all repeat. Foucault warned about these idioms in his 1979 lectures on biopolitics. Ideological obfuscation is the third of neoliberal capitalism, which will be exemplified in the adoption of the entrepreneurial self, as that generates distinctive psychological reactions. Okay, and this is, I think, the other really interesting aspect of all this, which is that neoliberal psychology, neoliberal psychologisms, neoliberal idioms hide themselves within Marxist rhetoric. And in this book, he talks about how the Marxist rhetoric in China is really a cover for the neoliberal subjectivity that is creating underneath its citizens. So the Marxist rhetoric in China, which creates that neoliberal subjectivity, finds its parallel in the West in terms of neoliberal feminism and neoliberal intersectionality, which rainbow washes the real problems and kind of diminishes the idea of class, turns everything into an unpaid emotional labor aspect of our lives, and creates a form of neoliberal subjectivity in terms of our relationships with one another. Again, this is a worldwide process, and now we go to India. Urban Indian workers are expected to largely follow the ideology of Western corporate culture through individual transformation, embracing a self-orientalizing framework, acquiring new behaviors of increased emotional attention, emotional intelligence, assertiveness, flexibility, productivity, and self-regulation. Again, all the things that are imposed upon male prisoners through the Duluth model. The corporations deploy a series of personality tests to recruit, evaluate, and to assess the personality types and traits of the employees. Soft skill psychological workshops are conducted to create assertive, confident, happy, and self-reliant workers. For instance, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or the Big Five, or the 5 languages of love, or all these really stupid pop psychology idioms, and transactional analysis inventories are two of the most commonly used instruments for training purposes in Indian corporations. On August 13th, 2018, Facebook, citing a clause on its terms of service barring hateful, threatening, or obscene media, deplatformed Telesur English, an English language Latin American news network. Telesur is funded by a number of Latin American states, including Venezuela, and offers news and opinions from a progressive viewpoint. It was set up to provide an alternative to Western corporate-dominated media. So cancel culture is coming back from the back to bite us in the ass. And the people on social media, when you complain about cancel culture, you are not even allowed to complain about cancel culture. And this is, in fact, a tool of neoliberal colonialism. It gets hordes of underread, undergraduates to yell at people that they don't understand the full implications of what's going on, including me. I was participating in protests against Jordan Peterson as well, even though he was my own professor. The neoliberal episteme is a normative order of reason that has become a widely and deeply disseminated economic rationality, which transmorgifies every human domain and endeavor according to a specific image of the economic. The neoliberal episteme makes things meaningful to us, and that's what I wanted to talk about. In the desert of nothingness, and this is why I call neoliberalism a form of ideological religion. I think of it as an ontotheological platform for us to deal with our existential crisis from our perspective of being thrown into this world. It provides us with meanings of things. It constitutes our schema or psychological tools for perceiving, feeling, thinking about, remembering, motivating, expressing, desiring, and disliking things. In fact, when you point out that this neoliberal episteme is problematic, you're not only getting people who think that they are progressive to fight back against you, what you're doing is you are striking at the root of their fears, because there is no meaning without a neoliberal episteme. You are throwing people back into the desert of nothingness. That's what happened when Jordan Peterson faced Slavoj Žižek on stage in Toronto a couple years ago. What happened was Zizek threw Jordan Peterson's neoliberal episteme back into the desert of nothingness, thus re-evoking the addictions to try to create meaning within Jordan Peterson himself. And you can see that his teeth haven't healed from that. With regards to publications in academia and elsewhere, Carl Ratner writes, publication output is also neoliberal in a sense of being an abstract quantity, regardless of content or quantity. It is analogous to industrial production. Sell more products to increase returns. Exploit surplus labor. Citation impact is equally commodified in that it is the number of times a publication is cited. It has nothing to do with the quality of the content. It is possible that all the citations critique and refute an article, yet it will be highly valued for its citational ranking. All these indicators conflate quantity with quality. They imply the quantity of money, publications, and citations equal high quality. And you can see this same process reflects itself within who we choose to endear in our system today. Joe Rogan and Vaynerchuk, guys that tell you, you can do it. You know, people who disagree with you, people are just jealous of your success. Your exploitation of surplus capital, there's nothing wrong with that. You need to make efficient economies of scale. If you don't know what economies of scale are, the bigger things are, the more you buy, the cheaper it is for you. That's what economies of scale are. You need to make sure you are following all these economic precepts, and the closer you follow these economic precepts, the more successful you will be, and likely you will be. But you have to make sure to throw out your Kantian ideals of treating everybody as an end in themselves, and you must, in fact, throw in and reconstitute everyone as a means to an end. And this is what psychology does. Treat society as a means to an end. In doing so, people become less communal and, in fact, need more psychology. So psychology, and in fact, the whole discipline of psychology reproduces itself in this social reproduction because it destroys communities by enforcing this culture of seeing other people as a means to an end. And as a result, it recreates its own profession, and people are more and more in need of a therapist rather than what we really need, which is community. And the reason why psychologists fail to see that is because a lot of psychologists, and I'm so sorry to generalize like this, but a lot of psychologists go into psychology because they have themselves a problem that they themselves can't deal with. And you can see neoliberal psychology at play, because people who go through the individuation process, through the Jungian individuation process, at the end of that process, they realize, oh, I've healed, and now I can go and heal other people. I see the evil and good within myself, and now I can go and heal other people, and I can make money from it. And you can see this self-perpetuating system within neoliberal psychology destroying and becoming this cancerous thing within society. And a lot of our Instagram idioms and a lot of these Duluth model psychologies, these Kimberly Crenshaw backed Duluth model psychologies, the so-called intersectionality, and intersectionality, which reduces everybody to individuals, cannot see the broader implications of society like us philosopher kings can. The capitalist form and function and value of knowledge makes critique of capitalism difficult. Critique would violate the capitalist value of knowledge and would be rejected as unproductive and not viable to the market. And more so, you are implicating meaning. You are attacking the concept of meaning in our society, which creates an ontological fear within people, especially within psychologists. When you attack psychologists, you are basically attacking their whole profession. And when you do that, you are making them question the whole profession itself. And as a result, you become a psychological burden. And that's why psychologists today have come together to release articles about how Kantian perspectives of the world are formed by biases, and there's a whole conflict of the faculties there. So I encourage you to take a look at my Paranoia of the Conflict of the Faculties video, where I talk about how from one side, philosophy is being attacked from the discipline of psychology, and from the other side, within philosophy itself, there is an attack from within the intersectional, prescribed intersectional, covertly neoliberal perspectives of the prescribed intersectionality people who in fact agree with a lot of these psychological principles of treating people as a means rather than ends, of shutting people up. And both those aspects are attacking whatever is left of philosophy. I used to be very critical of the analytical philosophers, but today I find myself hiding behind them because they're the only ones that believe in the agora, it seems. It's from the critical theory, which I am a part of, that neoliberal psychology has taken over, which is really, truly scary. Critiquing the capitalist profit motive would be rejected as this is not useful for individual success on the economic market, nor does it generate profit. So let's not talk about it. Even if I like the idea, it is impractical. Market practicality and the profit motive would disqualify the capitalist critique without considering the merits of the content. So you can see that we are also in a damned if you do and damned if you don't situation. Psychiatry as neoliberal ideology. And we all have problems with psychiatry. I don't think I need to get into the problems of psychiatry and their pharmaceutical systems. You know, you go into prisons and these psychiatrists, they come and they basically are drug peddling to the most vulnerable people in our society. They say, do you want something that makes you feel better? Huh? This will make you feel better. Psychiatrists are truly evil. Ideology is not confined to political and I'm not speaking from my asshole. Ideology is not confined to political ideologists who directly promote the capitalist political economy, such as Hayek, Milton Friedman, Bill Clinton, Obama, the Chinese Communist Party, I love it, and Ayn Rand. Political economic ideology exudes throughout the social order in order to obfuscate the oppression that pervades the diverse social nodes or macro-cultural factors. It is important to identify these diverse cultural expressions of ideology in order to expose their obscurantism and mystification that stunts consciousness about social and psychological life. Every macro-cultural factor must be subjected to ideological critique in order to elucidate the reality of macro-cultural factor that ideology obfuscates. One important macro-cultural factor that expresses neoliberal ideology is the discipline of psychology, which includes academic psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry, and government policies and governing policies about mental health and dysfunction. Psychology always promotes the social system of which it is a component of. That's all psychology does. Psychology, the role of psychology is to integrate you within the system as is. In neoliberal society, psychology promotes neoliberal ideology in the form of academic scientific concepts, methods, interventions, and health policy. This psychological ideology or ideological psychology is an essential element that is absorbed into neoliberal psychology. Fabregas describes how various ideologies in American psychology personalize problems that are actually social and political. This leads to shifting socio-political problems in the individual level, which perpetuates the problems themselves. This ideological critique of psychiatric medicine applies to all medicine. The entire medical industry focuses on treating symptoms of social toxicity while ignoring the social toxicities that causes the symptoms. Cancer and respiratory, this is a form of cancer. And you can see that, his Freudian slip, he goes into cancer right away. This is cancer. This is why he calls neoliberal psychology an STD. He calls it an STD. Carl Ratner calls it an STD. And he's right. It's a cancer because it causes the very problems and purports to solve them. And then it has an army of people who think they are being progressive that are shutting people up. They started with Jordan Peterson, but sooner and later, the guillotine came closer and closer. These right-wing people, they learned well from the French Revolution. So now I'm going to spend a couple moments talking about Chinese neoliberalism wrapped in Chinese psychology and Chinese Marxism. And for all the tankies out there trying to defend China from Western imperialism, firstly, if you don't speak the language of Chinese, you need to shut the fuck up. I don't understand why all these white people, these white monkeys, think that they can speak on behalf of China or what's going on in China when they've never been there. They've been there for 2 weeks. They don't understand what it means living within the neoliberal Marxist regime known as the CCP, the totalitarian colonialist regime, the neo-colonialist regime. Yes, just because they're Chinese doesn't mean that they can't be colonizing. In fact, you are patronizing people by looking at them as being, no, complicity is important. Oh, no, they're Chinese, so obviously they're just responding to colonialism. No, they are in fact enacting colonialism in themselves. And we need to call them out for that because that is true equality. 你说普通话吗? Do you even speak Chinese? Do you even read Chinese? I know my Chinese is bad, but it's better than yours. A lot of these tankies I get into debates with, people don't even speak Chinese. I did a whole essay on Confucianism. Sorry, I just get pissed off at these tankies. The World Inequality Lab reports on world inequality compiled by Thomas Piketty. Actually, Zizek says that we should read Piketty's book. I looked into it and I read a bunch of it, but it seems exorbitant. And other economists report that in China, the share of public property in national wealth has declined from about 70% in 1978 to 30% in 2015. Not to mention the fact that Xi Jinping has changed his own constitution, not from within the constitution, from outside his own constitution, which is a clear marker of authoritarianism, of totalitarianism. When you change your constitution from outside its own precepts, that is dangerous. So you can see the Chinese top 10% wealth share, 67% in 2015, is getting close to that of the United States, 72%, and is much higher than a country like France. So again, this comes from Piketty, and that's why Zizek wants us to read Piketty's work. Now, this is really important because a lot of these tankies are focusing on the defense of China as a form of defending against Western imperial colonialism, when in fact China is playing the same games that the West is playing. We are all part of this neoliberal religion. There's no out to it. For example, Western neoliberalism creates individualistic forms of ideology such as entrepreneurialism and what I would say also prescribed intersectionality that it employs in conjunction with pre-capitalist ideologies such as Christianity. Chinese neoliberal ideology incorporates strands of neoliberal individualism and psychologism, along with Chinese constructs and even Marxism, which we shall discuss momentarily, to cloak its neoliberal economic practices in a patina of people-oriented, community-oriented images. China has fully bought into this commodification of education and proudly strives to excel on these neoliberal rankings. Chinese neoliberal psychological ideology. Anthropologist Zhang expresses some of the ideological politics of Western psychotherapy and psychiatry in China. She says, with the help of Psi experts, Chinese people are told it is possible to turn social problems and suffering into a technical matter of sound personal choice and self-management. Such self-work is regarded by many Chinese experts to have the potential to contribute to broader social interventions by improving citizens' emotional outlook and fostering a sense of satisfaction. That is, reclaiming a serene and you can see that it's just so parallel when studying what's going on in China. It's just, there's so many parallels. Reclaiming a serene and resilient self capable of accepting life as it is. Zhu Ling eventually returned home and found herself in a strong position to take care of her family and work responsibilities. She felt less frustrated and burnt out and gained more inner strength to handle stresses. Zhang, 2017, endorses psychological ideology that exists in psychotherapeutic interventions in Chinese workplaces. She reports on large state-owned monopoly tobacco company that was under pressure, a tobacco company too, okay? Under pressure to reform by adopting new production methods and management styles to improve efficiency. Like the work of Amartya Sen, these changes placed greater pressure on workers to perform and compete for material resources, precipitating grassroots resistance and generating a great deal of anxiety. Discontent among workers is on the rise. At the beginning of the workshop I attended, 90% of participants reported how a very low happiness index, a popular imported well-being measurement guide frequently invoked by Chinese leaders and psychological workers in recent years. In China, there are a lot of rebellions all the time in different factories. There have been a lot of rebellions, but they're not reported on at all. They're totally censored within China and without, from outside China as well. The growing culture of compliance among disgruntled workers towards the enterprise management has alarmed upper-level managers. At the last dinner of the workshop, I sat next to the head of human resource management of a tobacco firm and asked him why he wanted to sponsor such training. Mr. Wu replied with such a big sigh. To tell you the truth, it is extremely difficult to do employee work today. They appear to be irritable, grumpy, and defiant towards any form of authority. The old thought work method based on political persuasion does not work anymore, while the new material-based method based on monetary reward does not seem to work either. I have tried everything, but only in vain. A friend suggested that I incorporate psychotherapeutic techniques, so I approached Mr. Ling. After the very first session, I noticed some positive changes already taking place among the participants. They became calmer, more positive, and less controversial, confrontational. Zizek says the difference between a boss that is the oppressive boss and the boss that's talking about, oh, how was your weekend? All the touchy-feely stuff. One is much more able to exploit surplus labor and capital than the other is. Amartya Sen-style capitalism.
Therefore, if they were able to develop the necessary skills through an increase in their freedom, it would result in being able to do more, and as a result, be freer. To understand how increasing freedom do more, and as a result, be freer. To understand how increasing freedom as opposed to productivity in the long term will be more beneficial, let's look in on two companies. The first company wants to turn its employees into robots. They come in, do their job for as long as possible, and leave without having used many resources. If anyone tries to speak out against this system, they get fired.
Item 1, the company is hiring 2, quote, intelligence analysts for its security division to track a whole host of threats, including protests, crises, and geopolitical conflicts that could affect the company's operations. So a corporate spy, essentially. But one bit of job description stands out. According to Motherboard, the job listing mentions labor organizing 3 times.
If anyone gets sick, they have no health care. There's not even any training. The managers hired by the company are all from other countries, and there is minimal bonding between the workers and managers that could lead to progression. Trying to force productivity in this manner has the opposite effect. Poor working conditions lead to below average products and a high turnover of employees. The second company is a cooperative and focuses on making sure its employees are looked after. They have fair pay, holidays, and breaks. If workers protest, the issues are discussed and solutions agreed, leading to a happier workforce. If they are ill, they have health care and are back to work quickly. Employees can get promoted quickly, and the motivation means staff turnover is far lower. The second company follows Sen's model, trying to focus on freedom beyond income, with a greater focus on self-improvement and quality of life. Chances are, though, they will also perform better than those working at the unfree company. Sen argues this inclusive, open management structure has been proven to be a more effective way of creating freedom in the lives of people in developing countries.
Consistent on this, I don't think the law has any role whatsoever in banning race-based discrimination by private actors. I know that's controversial. It shouldn't be controversial in the sense that I think a lot of things are evil and people engage in evil things every day that I think the government has no business in regulating.
With the election of Donald Trump, the dreams of liberalism were finally forced to come face to face with a cascade of unconscious feelings and biases. The political effects of how our limbic fear response systems, constantly scanning for threats in the environment, are prone to fire when strangers are abound, which occur in spite of, but also in addition to the endless negative culturally learned associations, had to be taken seriously. The new depoliticized language of self-care and professional guidance for emotional well-being that you can find all over Instagram by progressive leftists, provided by psychologists, appear liberating and heartwarming to those feeling trapped in their workplaces. In such training, the proper management of emotions, spread by feminist neoliberal psychology instead of socioeconomic problems, becomes the focus of intervention. As Mr. Wu succinctly put it, our goal is to instill a positive outlook on life among workers by using positive psychology, while making them realize that even if one cannot change reality, one can still have control over how he decides to respond. And this realization is powerful. He wanted workers to feel happier because that would make his job easier. One can easily criticize the therapeutic approaches for the inherent risk of psychologizing social and economic problems and conflicts. Yet, one cannot easily discount its appeal to and impact on Chinese workers. The new therapeutic attention to emotions is a viable alternative to the political thought work to which they are subject for years. The visceral transformations they experienced personally through such workshops, feeling happier, recognized, and validated, having their emotions listened to, cannot be simply dismissed as a result of a false consciousness. One worker who went through the psychological workshop said, "I have come to realize that even if I cannot change the system, it is possible to create happiness and retain certain control of my life." Sure, I went through the Jungian individuation process too. But at the end of the day, I still realize that we are exploiting surplus labor en masse. So you are basically castrating these people. And I use the word castration because that's what this whole emphasis on toxic masculinity does. Toxic masculinity is a danger to the system. This kind of toxic masculinity that is imposed by what Zizek says Greta. Greta is the number one toxic masculine person. And in fact, we need a toxic masculinity to truly point their fingers at what's problematic. Greta is right. And Greta is a toxic masculine representation of toxic masculinity. This is very illuminating commentary on the nature of ideology in the form of therapeutic intervention in relation to the state of Chinese neoliberal practices. Zhang's account begins with a concrete description of neoliberal economic pressures that were imposed by the managers of the state company and oppressed and distressed the workers. The managers were unsettled by the discontent and sought to pacify the workers. Marcuse describes false consciousness in the one-dimensional man. The populace in capitalist society is bought off, co-opted by material rewards to subjectively feel comfortable and to accept the political economy. Marcuse coined a pregnant term, repressive desublimation, to denote that pleasure is cultivated and expressed, not sublimated, but remains a repressive factor because it denies true fulfillment. False consciousness has that character. Denying false consciousness under conditions of oppression legitimates that oppression. It pretends that oppression is really fulfillment simply because workers feel happier and do not express or focus on their oppression. In fact, if they express their oppression, they are going against cognitive behavioral therapy. The use of ideological psychology, to engineer workers' false consciousness is an indictment of the system that employs ideology. This is a system that was exported by the West, for it reveals that the system is oppressive and seeks to maintain its oppression by obscuring and pacifying the workers to conform to it. Ideology reveals that the system does not want to politicize and empower workers to understand the politics of work and to improve them, and to not revolutionize, to change the whole idea of class. To change the whole class system is not even a question. And this system is the Chinese government. It is the government that owns the tobacco company, hires its human relations manager, approves the alienated work conditions in which workers have no democratic input, and also approves Mr. Wu's use of psychological ideology to suppress discontent and depoliticize and pacify workers. I don't really like this idea of depoliticization. I think that this is an active politicization. This is politicization. It's the state that's doing all of this, whether it's the West or the East. Ideology crystallizes this entire system. It is a total social fact. Of course, all this contradicts genuine socialism, a democratic collective society in which workers owned and controlled workplaces would have neither oppressive alienating working conditions nor ideology to obscure them. nor mystified false consciousness that misperceived them as fulfilling. It's kind of sad. Several powerful critiques of individualistic ideological psychology in China explain and amplify my critique of it. Ma, in 2012, reports that Chinese psychiatry has turned towards Western neoliberal individual biomedical causes and cures for medical illness. Contemporary psychiatrists construe schizophrenia as a disorder of the self. The social psychology issues that concern patients and families were seldom given any attention by the staff. Yang, 2018, explains how the individualistic neoliberal therapeutic ideology employed in Chinese psychology to explain away the social crisis of mental illness without impugning the political economy that caused it. The incidence of mental illness has increased exponentially from the 1950s. Yang argues that the mental health crisis was mainly brought about by dislocation and rapid change amidst China's economic restructuring since the 1990s. Living in China, living in Chongqing, I see these people who are the villager people, so family, so powerful with their families. They have strong families. They have strong family ties. They have extended family relationships. They do all of the old traditions, and they are happy, and they come into the city, and that's why I love Chongqing so much. And Chongqing versus Beijing, where this Beijing culture is going and colonizing, basically homogenizing the rest of the multiculturalism of China and turning all of that into this neoliberal subjectivity, just like everywhere else in the world, just like with Russia, just like with everywhere else. And you can see that clash of cultures happening. And these happy Chongqing people, they don't know what's in store for the next generations. They don't know what's in store for their children. Because I've been to Beijing, and I see in Beijing, there's so much pollution, and everybody is just sad and individualistic. Pure cyberpunk invading into the anarcho-primitivist, the primitivist kind of ways. Read James C. Scott's work on Seeing Like a State. Fu et al. Confirms these political economic causes of problems such as psychological depression in China. They found that depressive symptoms of both rural urban migrants and rural residents are significantly higher than those of urban residents. I don't need any study to tell me this. These rural people, they spit, and they're not clean, and they do all the weird things, and I don't want to get into that kind of thing because it's going to get a little bit racist or something, but they're not civilized. They're not civilized. And versus the civilized Beijing person who is utterly depressed. Such differences in depressive symptoms can be attributed to socioeconomic status and proximate stressors such as unemployment, living alone, and the unaffordability of medical services. Rural people have strong families, and strong families were what the left used to have before the feminists destroyed the idea of family in the West. The idea of family being destroyed in the West really was the utter destruction of the ability to be able to resist against neoliberal subjectivity and capitalism. With the destruction of the family came a deep form of depression that we can find in the West that I saw its utmost character of in Vancouver while living in Vancouver. This restructuring is neoliberal policy in the political economy. It includes social injustice, rising housing prices, widening income gaps. In other words, the government has used psychology as ideology to obfuscate the neoliberal political, economic, oppressive causes of behavioral problems, which, if known, would cause resentment and rebellion. The focus on psychological and personal care diverts attention from social and economic processes that could spark criticisms of the state. Instead of revising its political vision and economic policies in ways that would soften the negative impact of rapid socioeconomic change, government programs promoting happiness and psychotherapy seeks to compel individuals to become responsible for their own self-care. It is too much emotional labor to give a shit about the collective. You can find the same neoliberal idioms found within progressive thought throughout Instagram in so-called leftist culture in the West. Toxic masculinity, you need to go to therapy, therapy culture, imposing therapy culture, instead of realizing the importance of community. This psychological ideology is entirely intentional. Officials and managers know that the social and psychological problems are creations of government policy, Pang 2018, and they simply obfuscate this reality. There is no intrinsic conditions that would make these problems appear to be caused by personal deficiencies. This process guides people to question their own mental capacities rather than look at social conditions when faced with a crisis. The neoliberal model of society and psychological discourses stresses that individuals take responsibility for the deficiencies and injustices that they experience. Ultimately, psychology has become a new language that speaks to people about rebuilding their identities around an emotional core that obfuscates the socioeconomic dislocation they experience. The state needs psychology as a kind of prop. Psychology masks the inadequacy of other social and governing resources. It obscures the possibility of more complex, responsible approaches to socioeconomic issues. State-sponsored psychological ideology complements its positive psychology with propaganda that condemns anger against social practices. Yang tells us today, in today's China, the government has placed great emphasis on happiness and well-being, and a popular association has emerged between negative emotions and ill health. Recent community billboards include signage promoting the work of Dr. Chao Yan, a cardiovascular surgeon at Beijing Anjin Hospital, who has written about the role of anger in triggering heart disease. Local psychosocial workers also reference Dr. Chao's writing when dealing with Changping residents through anger management. Anger management is how we castrate men in society today with our Duluth model prison systems. Thus, anger management is ideological psychology that blunts opposition to neoliberalism. And the use of psychological care enables the state to appear to be caring and helping the populace overcome its problems, while actually eliciting their conformity, the conditions that generate the problems. Chinese psychology is ideological in appearing to be helpful, while obscuring the harsh maintenance of oppression. This is the equivalent of the witches in the West. The witches with their Jungian psychology and trying to have all these positivism, social capitalism, destruction of resistance to neoliberalism. Yang insightfully observes that Chinese neoliberal psychology is not limited to individualistic ideology of bourgeois psychology. Chinese neoliberal ideology supplements bourgeois individualism with traditional, indigenous Chinese psychological moral constructs. We do that in the West too. How much of our indigenous, I believe, by the way, a lot of these indigenous ideals, that's why I look to ritual and I believe in the concept of ritual. But you can also conform indigenous ideals into your neoliberal ideology, and that's what. And I'm actually a Confucianist. I love Confucianist religion, but I can see also that Confucianism is used to prop up the CCP neoliberal state. These perform the same ideological function as individualism, which is to distract attention from political economic problems and solutions. The equivalent of this is indigenous revival, is the paganism, the witch paganism in the West. Confucian social philosophy was adopted by emperors in order to obfuscate oppression and social upheaval by appealing to proper, respectful behavior for the masses. I think he's going to point to Taoism here, and I'm going to say that Confucianism is more radical than people think. And for that, you have to look at my Ritual Traces series. Yang explains that official anger deregulation strategies downplay sociopolitical factors by invoking Confucian and Taoist constructs of anger. Psychosocial workers in Changping who are sponsored by the government tend to follow 8 principles to guide community-based anger management and alleviate the anger and frustration of laid-off workers. 8 principles, 5 love languages. I hate this shit. These strategies are also widely adopted by Chinese employee assistance programs, EAP practitioners. These highly individualized strategies align with Western medicalization as well as Taoism and Confucianism, with more emphasis on Taoism. Buddhism in the West. Taoists seek to eliminate the reason for anger via cognitive reappraisal or purposeful neglect of the sources of anger. Confucianists accept the reason for one's anger and encourage higher moral indignation rather than lower physical violence expressions of the emotion. One must restrain one's emotions and do what is right to conform to social norms for greater unity rather than giving into passion or anger. I'm not going to read his Confucianist stuff because I think Confucianism is more complicated than this, and you can reevaluate, and it's a religion. It's a religion. You can interpret it however you want, and to conform it to whatever ideology you want. So these examples demonstrate. I don't like these examples, so I'm going to move on. These examples demonstrate the discipline of psychology is a macro cultural factor. The academic, the methodology, the psychotherapy, the interventions that participates in the canonical model of culture. So here he's referring back to his own methodology. So Chinese psychological, philosophical, ethical concepts, all of these work in psychological forms to constrict perception, cognition, motivation, emotions, pleasure, imagination, and self-conceptions in ways that obfuscate and accept neoliberal features of the status quo. Chinese psychology illustrates the complexity of ideology as a cultural factor in neoliberalism. We must understand why the Chinese Communist Party has embraced American bourgeois psychology as well as indigenous Chinese psychology as an element of its ideological system. They take from Confucianism itself and create a neoliberal Confucianism, neoliberal Marxist Confucianism. It's incredibly interesting and incredibly complex. And if you haven't done any reading about Confucianism, about Chinese Marxism, if you haven't lived in China, if you can't read Chinese, if you haven't done Chinese etymology work, I mean, who are all these people who have a say in what's going on? Like, what's his name? Like Bausch. Who is this guy who keeps talking and all these leftist people listen to him? Who is this guy? This embrace contradicts CCP's propaganda of embracing Marxist socialist philosophy. Of course, there are a lot of contradictions, but again, contradictions are not a problem with human thinking. They are a feature of human thinking. Cognitive dissonance is a feature of human thinking, not a problem. One would expect that the CCP would encourage the development of Marxist psychology to explain and intervene into pervasive psychological problems that are obviously caused by macro-cultural factors such as government-imposed layoffs and state-owned enterprises. But the CCP is not at core a Marxist nation. If it was, Xi Jinping wouldn't be implicated in the Panama Papers. A Marxist psychology would develop Marxist consciousness in patients and their relatives and would draw them into the struggle for socialism. None of this happened. Marxist psychology does not exist in China, nor do Marxist critiques of bourgeois psychology exist. Marxist economics is also rare in China. Chinese economics is almost entirely neoliberal economics. Even Communist Party schools, which educate party cadre, teach neoliberal economics rather than Marxist economics. This makes it impossible to approach socialism since the party cadre knows little of what Marx meant by it. I'm thinking the first time I went to China, I was like, oh man, I don't know anything about China. I have to study the whole history of China. So I read and read and read, and I go there and I talk to normal people, and people are just like, what? They don't have any idea of their own history either. This telling choice of bourgeois psychology over Marxist psychology reflects the character and objectives of the CCP, because all psychology in all societies reflects the political economic needs of the dominant class. Wow, in one sentence, thank you. All psychology in all societies reflects the political economics needs of the dominant class. We go back to the West. Everything that psychology teaches us, the disciplines of psychology teach us, especially through pop psychology, through non-introspective pop psychology. I'm sure there are plenty of psychologists that talk about capitalism, and those are the ones that I really focus on. The CCP prefers American psychology because it is an ideology that obfuscates neoliberal practices. It is neoliberal practices which cause psychological problems, and rather than replace these practices with Marxist socialist practices or rituals, the CCP obfuscates its neoliberal practices with the pretense that they do not exist and the problems are caused by individual factors. Again, how the CCP goes into the Xinjiang region and tells these Islamic thinkers, oh, you have psychological problems. Just like that type of gaslighting, we see gaslighting in this respect as well. This is how psychological ideology serves neoliberal capitalism in China. This reflects deeply on the Chinese state, as all psychology does, according to our Figure 1 and Marxist historical materialist culture theory. In particular, bourgeois psychology is proof positive that Marxist philosophy is dead in China. For if Marxism were functioning, it would vociferously attack bourgeois psychology. Western Marxists did this in the 30s, 60s, and 70s. The absence of Marxist critique of Western psychology proves that Marxism does not exist in any effective manner in China. China's embrace of bourgeois psychology pierces the fig leaf of its Marxist ideology. This is the revolutionary social political role that macro-cultural psychology can play from its academic perch. So people say, why does the CCP even call itself at all Marxist? Well, it's because 100 years ago, it forcibly destroyed its own Confucian religions, its own traditions, with the guise of Marxism. It went in and destroyed the statues of the opium of the people, caused a lot of historical trauma. And so it needs that Marxist ideology. It needs to put up statues of Marx and Lenin here and there, or whoever, and Mao, because Mao killed so many people to make the Cultural Revolution happen. And that is the whole basis upon the existence of the regime. But obviously, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, or even before that with Deng Xiaoping, the neoliberal reforms led by Deng Xiaoping changed the whole character and practice of the CCP, and now you can see a rise in Confucianism once again in China. And this is not the real Confucianism, this is a CCP form of Confucianism. The Marxist critique of bourgeois psychology and economics is not a random oversight. It is necessarily and deliberately stunted. The CCP must ensure that Marxism cannot exist and critique bourgeois psychology and society. Marxism is a thorn in the CCP's side because it contradicts neoliberalism that CCP practices. The CCP is thus forced to contort Marxism into an ideological defense of neoliberalism. And this is kind of what you find in terms of accelerationism, maybe. And this is especially what you find with regards to the unpaid emotional labor logic of Engelsian feminism, Gramscian feminism that we see in the West. The reason why I'm reading this is because it's a parallel to the Marxist ideological positions of Western world. This is an accomplishment through the slogan, socialism with Chinese characteristics, which basically means neoliberalism. This converts socialism into anything that the CCP practices. Neoliberalism is ideologically disguised as a Chinese characteristic of socialism. And in the West, neoliberalism is ideologically disguised in terms of this rainbow washing intersectionality. Thus, socialism with Chinese characteristics is a neoliberal ideology. Thus, rainbow washing, prescribed intersectionality, unpaid labor, turning every aspect of our lives into cost-benefit analysis is a guise, is a mask, is a veil for neoliberal ideology. The CCP is more afraid of genuine Marxism than it is of capitalism. And the same could be said for Western neoliberal Marxism. For genuine Marxism threatens to expose the CCP's neoliberal orientation. Capitalism is not a threat to the CCP because the CCP embraces capitalism in many ways. This is true for all ideologies. They must prevent the actualization of the ideological terms that disguise their reality while they encourage the actualization of the terms that oppose their ideology. They discourage what they avow and encourage what they disavow. Roxane Gay feminism. Say one thing, do the other. It's too much emotional labor to act. It's, I will do all the virtue signaling I want. This is a massive mystification. The United States squelches genuine democracy, which it avows, while encouraging autocracy, which it disavows, in its support for dictators and capitalist autocrats. The CCP has contorted Marxism in its vast system of Marxist education in universities. So much can be said in the same way with regards to how Marxism is taught in the universities in the West. Communist Party education for its members, Marxist institutes, Marxist propaganda, and Marxist conferences. Why do you think Zizek is banned from China now? Because he was an actual Marxist. These treat Marxism as a dry, abstract, formulaic, boring statements that have no relevance to real life. Again, parallels with regards to the Gramscian Marxists calling the old Marxists as being economic reductionists rather than looking at the economy itself as a form of reductionism. I recently interviewed a dozen undergraduates who had completed the mandatory 4 semesters of Marxism, and they frankly stated that they have no idea what Marxism is all about. They do not understand Marxist concepts. They are not interested in Marxism. They said their teachers present Marxism as I have described, with no connection to real-life events. This effectively dissuades people from pursuing Marxism, and it removes Marxism as a guide for social practice, and as a critique of non-Marxist social practices. I had a discussion with a group of professors in a Marxist institute, and I asked them what is their Marxist analysis of current Chinese society. Why? Because of the CCP enforced social capitalism that we find parallels to with our credit system. I call them the social capitalism, I call us credit system, or I can call us social capitalism, and I can call them the credit system. This is a sensitive topic, and we cannot virtue signal about it. Marxist scholars in a Marxist institute are prohibited from using genuine Marxism to analyze society that claims to be Marxist. I received the same responses from a colleague in the office at Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He whispered in my ear, "We should talk about this outside." He said that Marxist publications and conferences generally restrict Marxism to abstract theoretical concepts and historical debates in Marxism with no application to contemporary society. This sterilizes Marxism against critiquing non-Marxist social practices. The same kind of sterilization that happens with Western universities and why I'm on YouTube at all. Nor does the CCP use Marxism to explain social problems. CCP cannot provide a Marxist explanation of corruption, for example. In its newspaper, people daily, because that would trace corruption to the political economy that CCP commands. It would reveal that the CCP is really the source of corruption. So again, Marxism has to be expunged from social relevance, while being proclaimed to be the guiding political philosophy of China. Marxism is really hypocritical ideology that enables neoliberalism to flourish under a socially palatable banner. Guys, the same things are happening here. We have to look to China. We have to look at the very outside in order to be able to understand our own insights. Who is that? Balibar. Read Balibar. A final strategy for eradicating the contradiction between Marxism and neoliberalism is to suppress the independent study of Marxism outside CP parameters. Guys, the same thing is happening in the West. CCP closes down independent Marxist websites, and it intimidates independent Marxists who take action to practice Marxism. Several independent Marxist economists told me that their university's Communist Party secretaries insisted that they stop participating with urban workers in strikes and start teaching them about Marxist economics that would justify proletariat actions and make them more effective. My personal experience confirms this. I was invited to speak at the World Marxist Conference at Peking University in 2015. Conference officials had to approve my abstract. I presented Marxist ideas about socialism, and I left the audience with the question, does the current CCP practice conform to Marx's ideas of socialism? I did not answer the question, because if he did, he'd get his head chopped off. I left it for them. A news reporter heard my speech and wrote a one-paragraph summary that she posted online. Within 24 hours, it received 2.4 million views. Then it was censored and removed from view. So a talk on Marxism at an official conference on Marxism in a Marxist country that is governed by a Marxist political party is censored. Even the conference program and abstracts were never publicized. At the farewell banquet, the CCP head of Peking University exclaimed how nice it is to share common interests with colleagues around the world and to learn from each other and respect each other. The same kind of bullshit that you hear from Let's end this conference on a good note. I hate that shit. The CCP depletes and distorts Marxism in the same way that American capitalists deplete and distort democracy. And what I would argue here, and within this work itself, we will find a lot of these kinds of distortion that happen within Marxism happen in the West itself. They have to praise democracy in order to legitimize neoliberalism as democratic and free. They do so in grand spectacles of presidential elections. However, these are farcical theater that is devoid of genuine democracy, because genuine democracy threatens capitalist class structure and political, economic, social relations. Genuine democracy must be degraded, just as genuine Marxism is degraded in China. Chinese Marxism is the ideological equivalent of American democracy. Chinese CCP ideological Marxism is tamed and timid. It has stripped out Marx's radical, deep, critical, creative, useful, transformative, emancipatory character. The CCP ideological Marxism abandons Marxism as a guide to socialism. The CCP Marxism is an anti-Marxist as Stalinism was. It does less to promote international working class solidarity and class consciousness than Stalin did. Stalin at least provided support for worldwide communist organizations and Marxist publications. Xi Jinping never does this. He never visits workers' associations or poor people's associations. Actually, he does in the pictures, right? During his world travels. He only meets with capitalists and politicians. World Marxist movements must remain antagonistic to Chinese ideological Marxism. They must not afford it any opportunity to lead or represent Marxism. Of course, this does not apply to independent Chinese Marxists. Of course, there are a lot of independent Chinese Marxists. We're talking about the CCP here.
I think that comes a lot of what we're talking about with the submerged state, but also this notion that an awfully lot of what's happening when you assault labor, when you assault so many of the vehicles by which people might organize, might push back, it's really an assault on democracy itself.
Democracy is a threat to any power system. It doesn't matter what it is. I mean, for pretty obvious reasons. So yes, there is the general assault on the population includes a major assault on democracy. And what's happened in the United States is extremely revealing. One of the main topics in mainstream academic political science is study of comparison between public attitudes and public policy, which is a pretty straightforward inquiry. We see public policy, there's extensive polls, they're pretty reliable, they're consistent over time, so you get a pretty good sense of public attitudes. And the results are quite intriguing. By now, about 70% of the population is literally disenfranchised. They're the lower 70% on the income wealth scale. Their political representatives simply pay no attention to them. So it doesn't matter what they think. As you move up the scale, you get a little bit more influence when you get to the very top policies made. That correlates very... one of the major students of political participation, Walter Dean Burnham, years ago, pointed out that if you look at the non-voting in the United States is very high. He said if you look at the non-voters and their kind of demographics and compare it with Europe, they are the people who in Europe would vote for some Labourite or Social Democratic Party. But since no such thing exists here, they don't vote. Maybe they may not read academic political science, but they know that nobody's paying attention to them, so why bother voting? This is a plutocracy, it's not a democracy. And the effects are pretty striking.